Hi, welcome to a new video. I don't really do videos like this very much. I mostly just do like vlogs and stuff, but in 2024 one of my New Year's resolutions was to read more. I set the target of 12 books a month. A month? Jesus, no, 12 books in the year, so one book a month. To be honest, I was not a big reader. I'm definitely enjoying books more and more. I think a lot of people, I think it was like a thing, like a lot of people, BookTok definitely grew. My love for reading just flourished basically out of nowhere. I always used to think I wasn't a reader. I used to always say to my sister like, oh, I don't really think I'm a reader, not really for me, and she was like, you just haven't found the right books, and God was she right. So you can tell by the title that this is every book I read in 2024. I want to preface this by saying, oh, I haven't read 100 books, I haven't even read 50 books. I've read 10 books, which for some people is what they read in like, I don't know, like 2 months. It wasn't quite my goal was 12, but it was more than any other year that I've ever read books. So my goal is still 12 for this year. I like watching these videos, I like seeing people's opinions. I mean, none of the books that I've read, books you've never heard of, they're definitely all books you've heard of. I wanted to introduce in 2025 some more book related content into all of my platforms. So here we are. I have my phone so I can go on my Goodreads. I have 10 books, like it's not that hard to remember. So I can tell you what I like, rated them and stuff. My Goodreads will be in the description below if you want to go and follow. Let me explain like my rating scale. I'm gonna put it on the screen actually. 1 is I didn't like this book, I didn't finish it, or I finished it but it was a struggle. 2 is like finished it, was okay, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to anybody. 3 is like I like this book. Would I say it's groundbreaking or world changing? No, but I enjoyed it and I would definitely recommend it to people. 4 is I love this book, I would read this book again, I would recommend this book to people, I really enjoyed it, I was like page turner, really love the book. And then 5 is like I have 0 criticisms, this is the best book in the world, I want a tattoo of this book on my body, I love it. That is my like rating scale. Let's get into it. My first book of the year I don't actually have with me because I've lent it to a friend who wanted to read it. So my first book of the year was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I started the year off with this book because I'd watched the film and I love the film. I love the Hunger Games films. I haven't actually read the Hunger Games books, those are on my TBR for this year. But yeah, I just couldn't stop thinking about the film and I saw the book and I thought, I'm gonna get it. Technically I bought it for my sister for Christmas as like an extra present, but she hasn't read it and I have, so I guess it was more of a present for myself. Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes I gave 4 stars. Great way to start the year if you ask me. I think it was great. I would really recommend Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes to anybody who likes the film, likes the Hunger Games series. Most people know what it is. It's basically a prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy. It's basically Coriolanus Snow's backstory basically. I don't think that the book and the film are that different. I think any of the things that have kind of been cut out of the book for the film aren't like necessary key points that affect the plot at all. Some characters I don't care that much about, like in the book there's a lot more with, I forget his name now, he's like best friend that isn't his best friend, doesn't really like, but he's kind of getting tangled up with. There's a lot more of him in the book and honestly I don't really like him as a character. The actor, great, but I didn't actually like him very much as a character, so I wasn't actually mad that the film didn't have as much of him in. Actually when I was reading the book I was kind of like, can this character like, can we just like speed it up? But other than that I would say the film and the book are pretty like even level for me personally. Like I said, I would recommend the book. I've literally lent the book to somebody, so I loved it. I thought it was great. The next book I read was my first and only Colleen Hoover book that I've ever read, and it was Verity. So my sister had this book. This isn't my book, this is my sister's, and she was like, I think you'd like it. Like, she liked it basically. She was like, I think you would really like it. She was like, it's a pretty easy read, a fast-paced book that I think to keep me on the roll of reading, because obviously like I said I've only just started reading in 2024 really. She was like, I feel like this is a good one, and I would agree. I wouldn't necessarily say this would be enjoyed by people who either like really good literature or maybe have read loads and loads of books, so have a lot to compare it to. But as a beginner reader, I really recommend this, and I think that's kind of what most people say about Colleen Hoover books in general. I've never read any other Colleen Hoover book. I've not read It Ends With Us or anything. I mean, we have It Ends With Us downstairs, my sister's read it, but I haven't read it. This is my only experience with Colleen Hoover, and I really liked it. I know some people say this book's not very good, but again, I'm a new reader. I need something pretty simple, pretty easy to follow, quick read. Things happen that I didn't expect to happen, twists and turns, me being like, oh well, I think that maybe potentially this has happened, so I need to read to make sure, like, to see if what I think happened is what happened, if you get what I mean. I gave this book 4 stars. Now, if I read it again, maybe in like a few years, would I still give it 4 stars? I don't know. But when I read it, I enjoyed it. I'm not saying this is an amazing piece of literature, but I enjoyed it. This is actually the fastest I've ever read a book. According to my Goodreads, I started reading this on the 7th of February. No, the 2nd of February, and I finished it on the 9th. So I read this in a week, which again, for me, as a new reader, is very quick. The only thing I have put that I guess is my reason for not giving it 5 stars is the last chapter of the book. I didn't really like it. I obviously won't go into too much detail for anyone who does want to read it. I don't want to spoil it, but basically the gist of it is it's like kind of a thriller love story kind of book. So basically this girl, I'm trying to remember, I don't remember like the full detail, but basically she's a writer. The book starts with the girl seeing someone get hit by a car or a bus or something, which obviously got me gripped to begin with. She's a writer and she is basically struggling to like write, if I remember correctly, and she meets this man who, his wife is like an amazing writer, like really well known, but she's like not very well. She's like bedridden, can't move. I can't remember exactly why. She needs someone to kind of help with her next book. Like this writer woman, Verity, the woman, she has like a contract where she needs a new book out, but she can't write it. So the main character of the book, the other character, I forget her name, Lowen, goes and lives in this house with the man to help the woman finish her book. And a lot of strange things happen. The relationship between the man and Verity is like slightly odd. Verity herself is very weird. Obviously there's like sexual chemistry and like romance between Lowen and the man, but obviously he's married to Verity. It's like a whole thing. And my only issue was the last chapter, where again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there's like Verity is saying something and you don't know if it's true or not. And I basically put that if I believe that what she said at the end of the book is true, because that's the whole thing, like, is she telling the truth, then the whole plot is based on miscommunication, which I hate. That's one thing I hate in books. Actually, I'll get to this because this is a reason why I didn't like a book later on down the line. The next book that I read, which I also don't have because I didn't really like it, so I got rid of it. People might not be happy about this one because I feel like maybe this is a controversial take. The next book that I read, I actually DNF'd, was Normal People by Sally Rooney. I gave this book 1 star, which if you remember, 1 star means I did not like this book. I did not finish this book. I just did not like it. Read more than I feel like I probably should have, because obviously I know so many people love this book. I've never watched the show either. Like, I was gonna read the book and then watch the show. And I know so many people love it, and I was like, am I okay? Like, am I the only person in the world who doesn't like this book? Apparently not. Like, I read some reviews and some people agreed with me. I just found the book so boring. I've just read 2 books that I'm like enthralled in and love and read so quickly, and then I'm coming onto this book and I'm just bored. Get that it's about like normal people, normal life, mundane kind of issues, and like nothing major really happens. I guess for some people it's really good, but that I don't want to read about normal people. I don't want to read about normal life. Like, I'm a normal person. I live a normal life. I want to read about something that isn't real. I know some people like books because they can relate to them, but like, I don't want a book that I can relate to. At least not yet. I want something that takes me out of the real world. I just can't get on board with storylines that are based on miscommunication. And I can get on board with the miscommunication at the start of the book, where they're young, they're in school, they're teenagers. But as the book goes on, like, they become adults, and I feel like all of the issues within their relationship and throughout the story could all be solved with a conversation. Maybe it's just because that's the type of person I am in my real life. Like if I have a problem, I just voice it and I just talk about it right there and then, and we solve the problem. But I just feel like if I'm reading a book where the whole thing could be fixed with one conversation, like it irritates me. Like I don't care anymore because you're pissing me off as a character. And I feel like that's what Normal People was. Like they could have just had a conversation and everything would be solved. So my first 3 books of the year were like 2 hits, 2 4 stars, and then 1 I didn't finish. So I was really like, I don't know what to read next. I really want to read something that I'm going to enjoy. I've never really read a series before. The only series I've ever read was the Tomorrow Turned Pretty trilogy, which I read in 2023. And I mean, those are pretty easy books, good books for new readers. At this point, I was kind of getting into book talk. A lot of videos were coming up on my For You page, and the same for my sister. And one particular series was being brought up a lot. And you can probably guess what series that is. This is kind of the catalyst / downfall of my reading journey. As you've probably guessed, the series was A Court of Thorns and Roses, the ACOTAR series. So let's get into it. First real introduction to like fantasy books. The first book, A Court of Thorns and Roses. Obviously that's what everyone references the series. I gave this book 4 stars. I loved it. Obviously I'd never had much experience with fantasy books before, so I feel like I was a little bit slow getting into it to begin with, because obviously there is like the world building, which obviously is required and definitely necessary, but I don't think it was too bad. Like I feel like I saw a lot of videos being like, this book you have to almost push through this book to get to the next one. I don't think it was that dramatic. I think that's a bit of a push. There is a lot of like world building, so it can be a little bit like slower, but I don't necessarily think that was a bad thing. I'm gonna try and give you a little brief explanation about what the book is about. I feel like it's hard to explain fantasy books. It sounds bad, but it's good. The main character, a girl called Feyre, she is mortal. She lives in the mortal world. So in this world, in Prythian, it looks like the United Kingdom map wise, like Cornwall area. Like down south is like what's considered like the mortal realm, like the mortal lands. Then above the wall, which I'd say is probably around like London, like central London, above that wall is like the fairy, the fae, magical creature lands. And when I say fairy, I don't mean like Tinkerbell. Think like big muscly men with giant wings that are kind of like bat wings, rather than like Tinkerbell. And it's basically about her and how she basically kills an animal that she thinks is an animal, but it's actually a fairy. There's a specific fairy who's not very happy that she's just killed basically one of his friends, but she didn't know. And it's the story about like her going off with him, like he's like, you're coming with me now because you killed my friend. That's like how the book starts, and it's all about like that. There's like a love story, there's red flags, there's characters that people love, people hate. It's very good. It's very good. I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want to ruin it, but like I feel like everyone has read this book at this point. I originally gave it 3 stars, and I literally but the reason I gave it 3 rather than 4 or 5, even though I did really enjoy the book, is because it felt a little slow and repetitive at the start. So I actually originally gave this book 3 stars, and then I think once I'd read other books in the series, I actually went back and gave this book 4 instead, because I think I felt like it was a bit slow and repetitive. But then once I've read further, I kind of understood why it was so repetitive, and it was like almost forcing you to understand, like be like, this is the world, this is a whole, like think Harry Potter, like it's a whole new world. And I feel like it's repetitive to almost be like making sure you remember it, if you get what I mean. So I went back and gave it 4 stars. It's like the first half of the book that's a bit more slow paced. The second half of the book, a lot starts to happen in the second half of the book, especially like the last 100-200 pages. A lot happens and it's left on a cliffhanger. This isn't really like a spoiler, but Tamlin, I'm sorry, I didn't like him anyway. I don't want to be that person that's like, oh, I knew what was going to happen. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I was reading this book and I was thinking, Tamlin's the one that, like, people like him. I was reading, I was like, people like this man? No. And I was right. Obviously this book, like, it is the first in a series, so it has its like own plot, which I think it does well. Like it has its own plot that when it comes to the end, it feels like a conclusion, but it's also like, well, what else is going to happen? Because like half this book is world building and then the other half things happen, and you obviously know that there's more books, so it's like, what's gonna happen next? I started this book on the 2nd of March and I finished it on the 15th. So it took me just like about 2 weeks to read, which I think is a pretty good pace for me. And then the next is obviously A Court of Mist and Fury, which this is my favourite in the series. I gave this book 5 stars. Like, this is my first 5-star read. Literally obsessed with it, like to the point where I was getting like fan edits come up on TikTok because I was like interacting with so much content around this book and the character Rhys. Rhys is introduced in the other book, but this is kind of like his book. What can I say? I'm the same as every other girl in the entire world who's read this book and love him. Like, I'm not unique or different for loving him. Like I said before, when I was talking about normal people, at least not right now, I don't really like books that are like about real people or in the real world and normal people and mundane lives. I live a normal mundane life, I don't need to read about it as well. I think this book was my realization of why I was loving the fantasy books so much, is because it's the opposite of that. Like, this world doesn't exist, it's so out of the realms of real life. Anything can happen, and because anything can happen, I'm like, I want to know what happens. Like, it can be predictable in some areas, but it has the ability to not be predictable at all, because it could literally, anything could happen, and it's fantasy, it's not real, so it's fine. I would happily just reread this one on its own. I love this book so much. I think if you are like people who found this one like a little bit hard to get through, like, I disagree with that. I think it was fine. If you are that person and you haven't continued reading because maybe that one was like a bit slow, carry on, trust me, carry on. I started reading this book on March the 17th and I finished it on April the 3rd, which, how many days is that? 2 weeks. I read this one in 2 weeks and I read this one in 2 weeks, and this one's bigger, so that just shows like I picked up my pace with this one. I literally can't say more than I gave it 5 stars and I was obsessed. The second one is a little bit more like romantic-y. There's a lot more like romance in this one compared to the first one and this one. So like, I'd say first one, world building. Second one, romantic-y. Third one, war. There's still romance through all of them, but I feel like this is the most heavy on the romance. And this kind of deals with the aftermath of the first book, like the cliffhanger that it's left on, and it answers a lot of questions. War is like mentioned throughout the first 2 books, but it's almost kind of like a background plot, whereas this book is like, the war is happening. Like, this book is the war, and as you can see, it's a lot thicker. A Court of Wings and Ruin. I gave this book 4 stars, so still love it. Like, it's still great, but it took me a little bit longer. I read this book from the 10th of April to the 30th of April, so it took me 20 days to read. But I will say, my sister was reading these at the same time as me, and she was a book ahead. She told me to slow down because I was reading this too quickly, that I was gonna like catch up with her. So I did kind of slow down a little bit, but like, it's also a thicker book. So much happens in this book that it's kind of hard to remember everything. Like, I remember being like towards the end of the book and then being reminded of something that happened here and be like, oh my god, yes, oh my god, I forgot about that, because it's like so much happens. Like, this is not a slow paced book at all. So much is going on, to the point where it can get a little bit confusing at times, but you just gotta like go with it. It's not like a when's the next thing gonna happen. It's like, my god, can they deal with this much in such a short amount of time? This book like develops the relationships between the inner circle more, so you meet some more characters in the second book that aren't in the first, and I feel like this book develops those relationships even further, and you kind of learn the backstory more of certain characters. And there's also other like lords in Prythian. The first book you see a lot of one certain lord, and in the second book you see a lot of another second lord. In this one I feel like you start to learn more about like all the others. There's like 7, I think. None of them are like as main characters as the first 2, but they're there and you start to learn more about them, and you learn more about like Prythian and the world as a whole. I'm probably not explaining this very well. I'm probably explaining it very confusingly, but because of that, there is a lot of names to remember, and I remember I kept on getting confused about like who was who, and like the descriptions of them were like, right, that's that one, that's that one. If you have to write it down, I literally wouldn't blame you, because I was getting so confused at one point, but over time obviously you start to remember because the names are mentioned more and more and more. This book, probably out of all of them, toyed with my emotions the most. Things happen to certain characters and I was like, I'm gonna cry, I think was necessary, because like I said, it's about a war and I'm not that into war. So I feel like if I didn't have those like emotional parts, I could very easily get bored of like war talk and like army talk, and even in like a realm with like magical powers, that stuff can still get a little bit boring to me. You learn more about Feyre's sisters. So they're in the other books, but this one, they're in it a lot more. And Nesta is a character, one of her is her older sister. Well, they're both her older sisters. Feyre's the youngest one. A lot of people don't like Nesta in this book and say like her attitude is terrible, and I can see what people mean and I can see why people don't like her, but I disagree. I really liked her. I think she was just like a misunderstood character. I feel like she's that character that like if you can kind of relate to her in some sense, you're not gonna hate her, but if you can't relate to her and you can't see her like point of view and side to things, it can be difficult to kind of have sympathy. I personally like her, but Elaine on the other hand, I actually find her really annoying, and I don't see this, so this might be a controversial take as well, but Elaine gives off baby sister vibes, but she's not the baby sister. Feyre is the youngest out of the three of them. Elaine almost acts like the baby, like everyone has to look after her. I don't know, I just don't, she just irritated me in that sense. Like I feel like she didn't have much progression as a character. Overall, really liked this book. Confusing at times and can be a lot, and like if you took notes I'd be like valid, but necessary at the end of it. People see this series as like, this is like the original trilogy, and then the other books are like part of the series but add-ons. The majority of the books are from Feyre's point of view. You might get a chapter or so where it says at the top like Rhys, and like it's from his point of view. From a first person perspective of Feyre, which I mean obviously does affect the book because she's gonna have a certain perspective on certain things, whereas if you saw someone else's perspective you might get like a different vibe. But these three are all the same. These three, my reading was thriving, and then this was the downfall. This is like a little add-on book, which I was aware of before I read it, but because I was like, no, it's part of the series, like I need to read it. You don't need to read this. I took so long, and I mean so long, to read this because nothing happens. Some people love it. Some people, I saw some reviews and it was like, oh, it's like a fun, easy little book, like, you know, it's cute. 3 books, so much happens, so much character development, so many new characters, so much happens in those books that's what I'm expecting now. Like I'm reading these books because of that. So then when I start reading this and nothing is happening, nothing is added to the overall story from this book at all. And I almost feel like this book was either like a book to pass the time in terms of like what happens from this book to the next one, like just a passage in time, or the author had like a time restraint that she needed to meet and this one wasn't going to be done in time, so she wrote this just to kind of fill the gap. I feel like it doesn't fit into this series. Like I said, like so much is happening in these other books that this one in comparison just feels so slow. You've set the standard up here and it's not meeting the standard. So I gave this 1 star. It's either I didn't finish it or it was a struggle. I did finish it because I was determined to finish it, but it was a struggle. But keep in mind, those last 3 books, I basically read all of them, like each in like 2 weeks. 2 weeks for each book is kind of what I was hitting for this. This is like not even half this, like this is like half the size, maybe less, of the other book. Started reading this book on the 4th of May and I finished it on the 2nd of August. I technically almost did DNF it because I was struggling so much that I actually didn't finish reading it, and I listened to the audiobook for like the last third of it, because I was like, I just want to get this done so I can go on to the next one. And I think if it wasn't part of a series, if this was just a standalone book, I would have DNF'd it. And then the last one in the series, which actually is A Court of Silver Flames, as you can see, I'm currently reading this book. The next book, I started a 75 hard last year. Well, I finished a 75 hard last year. But if you don't know anything about 75 hard, there's a few rules that you have to follow every day. And reading 10 pages of a non-fiction book is one of them. Most people choose self-help books, but it doesn't actually have to be a self-help book, it just has to be non-fiction. So I chose The Mountain Is You by Brianna Wiest. But the whole idea of it is, it's like, you're the reason you're not succeeding, you are the mountain that you need to climb, you're procrastinating and you're standing in your own way, and how to stop that. 25 hard, you have to read 10 pages a day, which is what I did with this, because honestly there's not really chapters. I gave it 2 stars. Basically, it's extremely repetitive. I think if you were reading this book over a longer period of time, and it was kind of more just like when you felt like you needed motivation and inspiration, you kind of picked this book up and read it, then I think it'd be fine, because the repetitiveness in that sense is kind of essential. But because I was just reading it every day, I was getting very bored, because I was like, I have read this same paragraph already, just worded differently. Not necessarily like what it was saying was wrong or bad, like I actually think a lot of the advice in the book was good, but I've heard it 6 times. I no longer care, which is why I think I just wasn't into it. I'm also not a big self-help book person. Like I said, I read books to kind of escape the real world, and that is not what this is. For me, it's a no. And then my last book of 2024, which again, doing my 75 hard, I've just read a self-help book that I didn't really enjoy, and I thought, you know what, for my next book I'm not going to read a self-help book. So I was like, instead I'm going to read a book that I already own, which is Matthew Perry's autobiography, because I am a fan of Friends. Chandler was my favourite character in Friends. I have watched Friends multiple times. I have the box set, the extended edition box set. I have watched it on Netflix. I watch it when it's on TV. I love Friends. I think most people do. Chandler was my favourite character, and when obviously Matthew Perry died, I was very shocked and very sad about it. Again, was having to read 10 pages a day, but I was reading more than 10 pages a day because I was so in love with this book. I gave it 5 stars. So we have 2 5-star books of the year. I am not a big biography person. The only other biography that I actually listened to, I didn't read it, was Jeanette McCurdy's I'm Glad My Mom Died, and I'm glad that I listened to it, because listening to her talk it and like speak about it made the experience so much better. But I decided, obviously for my 75 hard, I had to physically read. Don't think I can fault it at all. I loved it so much. I knew that he struggled in life, and I knew that he'd struggled with like alcohol and drugs and things like that. I don't think I realized to the extent that it had affected his life, and even before he was in Friends, how he struggled with alcohol, and he just had like not the happiest of upbringings. So didn't realize how young he started acting, and how obviously Friends was like his big break, and even before then how he worked with people who were young and died young, and how that affected him. Also how he was one of those people, sadly, that got in an accident and then got prescribed drugs and then got hooked on those prescription drugs, and it snowballed. I don't think I realised how much it had affected his life until I read this book, and this book made me laugh, it made me cry, it broke my heart. And like, if he was still alive today, I would literally just want to give him the biggest hug ever, because I think he deserves, I'm getting teary-eyed talking about it, because obviously this is a real person who experienced these real things and is really dead, and it's hard and it's sad and it's horrible, and I'm getting teary-eyed about it. I think if you're a fan of Friends and you're a fan of Chandler and of Matthew Perry, then you should definitely read this book. I would highly recommend it. Like, I'm literally crying just talking about it. I also the whole story about how he got the role of Chandler on Friends really made me realize, like, I feel like the role was meant for him, and everything worked out in terms of his acting in that sense. Like, that role, because he almost didn't get it, was meant for him. I did see some criticisms about this book saying how it can get a little bit confusing, how he kind of jumps back in time, like he'll be talking and go back to something and then come back and then talk about something else, and it's not like a continuous, like it's not like A to B, which I understand it can be a little bit confusing, but I actually really liked that about the book, because I feel like it makes it feel almost more like a conversation. Like, I'm sat talking to him and he's telling me about his life, and he's talking about one thing and then it reminds him of something else, and then he goes back and talks about that, and then comes back and then talks for a bit and goes, oh, actually this also happened, rather than like a super, like, I've sat down, this is my life and I'm structuring it out. I feel like it feels more conversational and more natural, which I think for him works well. Like, maybe for other biographies it wouldn't work as well, but I think for him, like, it felt right. And another thing that I saw people criticize, which actually kind of like pisses me off a little bit and kind of annoys me, is I saw some people criticize that like it was very repetitive, and that he constantly was talking about how he would fall in love with someone really quickly and then be scared that he was going to lose them, so instead of them leaving him, he would leave them, or he would cheat on them, and then he would do drugs, and then he'd go to therapy and go to rehab and get better, and then repeat the cycle. And people were saying like it's very boring, it's very monotonous, it's just repetitive. And I was like, this isn't a fiction book. If this was a fiction book, fair enough, but it's not. This is about someone's real life, and unfortunately that is very real. People who deal with addiction, it's not like, oh, they go to rehab once. I mean, for some people it is, but for a lot of people it's not go to rehab once, oh, I'm miraculously better, my life is loads better. This man had real issues, and not just drug and alcohol. Obviously, like I said, him talking about like relationships and his issues with relationships and stuff. People don't get over that stuff like that. People have to change and make effort to change, and he talks about how he wishes he tried earlier, he wishes he made changes earlier, but he didn't, and there's nothing he can do about that now. And I think that kind of criticism I would accept if this wasn't a real story, but because this is someone's real life, I kind of find that criticism very almost insulting, and just very like, I almost want to say like self-obsessed. Like, you as the reader are upset that someone's real life is repetitive and they're not solving their problems straight away. Like, do you actually hear yourself? Because I don't know, maybe I'm taking it too personally, but I just think that kind of criticism over a biography is just insane to me, especially someone who suffered so much and struggled so much, and you're gonna tell me like, oh, it's repetitive. Yeah, well, that's life, unfortunately, and people's problems don't get solved easily, and not everyone does get help when they should, and not everyone is a good person. And I think one thing I loved about the book is how honest he was. Like, he talks about situations and he doesn't try and make it out like he is a good person. Like, I'm not saying overall he was a bad person, but he did bad things, and in certain situations he was the bad person in that situation, and he doesn't try and make it seem like he was, or try and excuse his behavior. Or like I said, like he says, I should have got help earlier, I wish I did. People aren't perfect, and I think that's what I like about the book, is it's very honest. And I don't think I'd be interested in a biography if I didn't feel like the person was being actually honest to themselves about situations. So those are all of the books that I read in 2024. We have 2 5-star books, is obviously A Court of Mist and Fury and Friends, Lovers and the Big Terrible Thing, Matthew Perry's biography. And we had a fair few 4s. We had some 2s, some 1s and a DNF. I feel like as far as books go for the year, I was very well rounded. My goal for this year is to read 12, so 1 book a month. Obviously, it depends on the books that I read. If I'm loving them and I'm reading them quickly, it might be more than that, but my goal is 12. I think for some people it's like easy breezy, but for me, I'm fairly new to reading, and not everyone has time to read. Like, I have other hobbies as well. Like, I like watching films, I like watching TV, I do nails, I have work, I go to the gym. I don't have all the time in the world to read, so I'm not going to be reading like 100 books anytime soon. So 12 for me is a good goal. The goal is to kind of get down my physical TBR, because I have a fair few books that I'm looking at right now in my room, and I got 2 more books for Christmas. I have like the Powerless series, I have all of them and I want to read them. I have the Rose Hill series, Elsie Silver. I have Wild Love and Wild Eyes. I have the Hunger Games series, because I've obviously read about it in Summers and Snakes, but I've not read the actual original Hunger Games series. And obviously there's a new Hunger Games book coming out this year as well. I have all the Harry Potter books. I have like Dune, which is fantasy but very different. I have a few books that have been lent to me by people that I feel like I should read. I just have a fair few books that I can definitely get through this year, and I'm very excited. And I'm also thinking, like I said, I want to introduce more like book content to my page, so I'm thinking that maybe not for every book that I read, but maybe for like the series ones, I might do like reading vlogs. That is everything I read for 2024, and I can't wait to read more in 2025. And look at my t-shirt, it's asked me what book I am reading. Perfect for it now. I will see you in my next video.